Good evening. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I'm the programmer at the Melbourne International Film Festival. Today's event is being held on the traditional lands of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Welcome to Discovering African Filmmaking, a MIF Talks event. We have an extremely strong lineup of panellists for you tonight, starting with Lizelle Bishkoff, who is a researcher and curator of African film and the founder of the Africa in Motion Film Festival in Scotland. Lizelle holds a PhD in African cinema from the University of Stirling in Scotland, in which she researched the role of women in African film. She has published widely on sub-Saharan African cinema and is a lecturer in film and television studies at the University of Glasgow, where she teaches African cinema. Dorcas Jutkovic is an award-winning Melbourne producer, writer, director, fine artist and artistic project officer. She studied fine art in South Africa and recently completed a Masters of Arts in Writing through Swinburne University of Technology. She's the producer and presenter of Oz African TV, the creative producer of One Beat, One Love, a project officer for Multicultural Arts Victoria, and the programmer of Emerge in Yarra 2018. Santilla Chingape is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker who has spent nearly a decade working for SBS World News. She presented the documentary Date My Race and is the writer-director of the documentary short Black As Me. Santilla created and curated Australia's first anti-racism all-day festival, Not Racist But, with the Wheeler Centre. She writes regularly for the Saturday paper and is a member of the federal government's advisory group on Australia-Africa relations. Santilla is moderating tonight's discussion, so I shall now hand over to her.
Thanks, Thomas. Welcome, everyone. This is a very exciting talk for me because I love African cinema, but it's also a very big topic, and obviously we only have an hour, so we'll try to get as nuanced as possible. But I guess my first question is there a thing as African cinema? What is African cinema? I mean, Lizelle, do you have an idea? What, when we talk about African cinema, what do we mean?
How much time do we have? I think the first thing I should say is, which is something that I always tell my students, is that we should really talk about it in the plural. So talking about African cinema as if it's one monolithic thing is completely wrong. So we should really always refer to it in the plural. It's a hugely diverse continent. With filmmaking industries that all have their own histories, influenced by the legacies of colonialism and what role France or Britain or some of the other colonizers played in the development of the audiovisual industries. And we see just this proliferation of different types of film from the continent. So we have Egypt, which has the oldest industry in Africa. After that, South Africa, although South Africa, of course, is a bit problematic because of the kind of nationalist filmmaking during apartheid, which wasn't really representative of, the country at large. And then we have the emergence of the Francophone West African industry at the end of colonization, so from the 60s onwards. When you start studying African cinema, like I did when I started, sort of embarked on my PhD research, the Francophone industries with filmmakers like Ousmane Sembène, Djibril Diop Mambeti, Suleiman Cissé, those are the names that sort of first emerge when you start sort of researching, because they are the best known filmmakers internationally. And what's been really interesting to me in my research, but also combined with being a curator, is just to discover over the past 10, 15 years the proliferation of different filmmaking activity from all around the continent. So when Africa in Motion started in the mid-2000s, there was almost no films, no Kiswahili films from East Africa, for example, and then suddenly the Kenyan, Tanzanian, Ugandan industries just kicked off, and now we find, amazing productions coming from there. So South African filmmaking, post-apartheid South African filmmaking is something that emerged, and just suddenly, films were winning awards internationally. And then, of course, we have Nollywood. That's, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with the low-budget video film industry of Nigeria. So, there's just so much going on. There is, all these different industries. So I think the idea of thinking of African cinema as one thing would be sort of completely wrong way of going about it. And just if I could add just one thing, I think the other thing to think about is what does it mean to be African? And I think that's a really interesting question as well. It's a question about identity. And for me, within the context of the festival, I've changed my own idea of what it means to be an African filmmaker. Like, what is an African filmmaker? For example, we have a short film competition in the festival, and initially we said as part of the criteria that filmmakers have to have nationality of an African country. So there's prize money involved, so you want to have a sort of consistent criteria. But then we started getting emails from people saying, well, I'm Black British, I've got British citizenship, but my parents are from Nigeria. Or, I'm from the Caribbean, and the reason, of course, why there are Black people all over the world is to a large extent due to histories of colonization and slavery. And so that completely expanded my idea of what does it mean to say someone is African. I'm African as well, but I'm white African, so I've got a very particular kind of positioning in terms of positionality as well. So even African identity is something that's so diverse and complex and linking that with film, you've just got this amazing, diverse sort of corpus of work to look at.
Yeah. What about you, Dorcas?
She pretty much covered it all. Yeah. But I think the one thing that that I'll if I can talk about it's representation and identity. And so for me, what African cinema means is what does it mean to be an African? And so I was given an opportunity to show off who we are on screen, so that people know who you are or what is your story, and also the idea of who can make African cinema. Like you were saying, other people are in diaspora, but they feel like they belong. Africa is their home, and so it's for me. It's the biggest thing about it is really identity and what you can do and the opportunities that people are given to tell their stories on cinema or on screen, period. And so, you pretty much covered the whole history, I think, and I'm not going to repeat that. But for me, when I look for African cinema, I kind of want people's stories rather than what we normally used to, the Western gaze onto what is expected of what the African person should be. So, so that's quite important for me when I think about the African cinema.
I think for me, it's a very interesting one because, as I was saying to you backstage, because I grew up in Zambia up until I was 9, and when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a lot of public service films that were made to educate people about HIV and AIDS, and so a lot of the films were sort of around those sorts of things. And I remember when my uncle brought a tape of The Gods Must Be Crazy, and I was like, ooh, that's, because it's funny how you are African, but you have a very removed experience to what African identity is. And so I remember when I was seeing The Gods Must Be Crazy, I was like, is that how people actually are in the village? Because I had no idea what it was like. And then I remember growing up and then being exposed to other films, but all of them seemed to, a lot of them were made in the West for Western audiences. And it was only until I was introduced to Francophone films, especially Ousmane Sembène's and Djibril Diop Mambete's films, and that completely reintroduced me to my Africanness, in that as a filmmaker, it liberated me to kind of sort of go against, the sort of Western way of telling stories, which is very much a 3-act structure of filmmaking. And it was very liberating for me because I was like, wow, you can actually experiment with film in a way that I had never been taught before through, the traditional sort of Hollywood films that I'd seen. So I guess I want to go back to what you touched on, Lizelle, with how we can't treat African cinema as a homogeneity, but rather as a diverse group. But I guess if we block off the regions and look at what inspired the filmmaking in those spaces, so let's think about Francophone Africa, for example, and that wave of filmmaking and what that sort of introduced, I guess, to the Western canon about what African identity looked like, and some of those ideas. I mean, what can you talk to us about that period and the kinds of films that were being made?
So, of course, in the immediate post-colonial period, there were certain very urgent priorities for African filmmakers. Someone like Ousmane Sembène was very much a fierce Marxist. He believed in the pedagogical power of cinema. He famously referred to cinema as the night school for Africans. He was a writer and turned to filmmaking in his 40s as a way of overcoming the illiteracy of what he realized a lot more people will watch his films than will read his books. So his films are very political. They're critical of the kind of neo-colonial elite. They tell sort of politicized and kind of awareness-raising stories. So it's serious cinema. It's cinema as, political tool. Then going a little bit further, when you look at the work of the famous Hélène of Suleiman Sissay from Mali and other films that are kind of set in pre-colonial Africa, so before Western influence, films that are set in kind of rural spaces, villages and so on. So you think of the work like Suleiman Sissay's Hélène, also the work of filmmakers from Burkina Faso such as Idrissa Ouedraogo and Gaston Cabaret. So that's a different kind of filmmaking. That is the filmmaking that is inspired by kind of mythical African myths, storytelling. There's a whole strand of African filmmaking that draws on the oral traditions of African and using storyteller using film as a modern way of storytelling. So in West Africa, the praise singers, the storytellers are referred to as griots, and it's been said that these filmmakers are modern-day griots. So this was, of course, an attempt to recover these pasts and these rich histories of African cultures that have been suppressed through colonization. So kind of, retelling these stories and reinstilling a pride in African tradition. So that's, again, another branch of filmmaking. Then I think what we also shouldn't lose sight of is that a lot of the early Francophone films were funded by France, of course, because France had a policy of continuing to support the cultural industries of its ex-colonies, which seems, of course, on the face of it benevolent, but actually it was a paternalistic way of retaining some sort of control because filmmakers were given money to make films, but the post-production was done in studios in Paris, and often, they didn't have a lot of control over, and there were, scenes would be cut, and Sembène made a film, Come to Tiaroué, which is a retelling of a massacre of West African soldiers who fought for France, or fought for the Allies in the Second World War, and this film, which was, a condemnation of, France's behaviour after the Second World War, was banned in France, and Sembène couldn't show the film there. So Sembène himself stopped using French money in 1968 because of this paternalistic, methods of keeping some sort of cultural control. So, so we also have to be kind of look at it slightly critical. So some of these West African films that are kind of serious films, art house films, became very popular in Europe as well. There's still lots of Francophone filmmakers that are quoted at Cannes, like Abderrahmane Sissako, because they make the kinds of films that Europeans think are African films. They make, it's a kind of aesthetic that people recognize as African cinema. So of course we can be critical to that as well, because does it present an exoticized view of Africa? So I think we have to sort of question that. You hear sometimes filmmakers from other countries say, you would think that Africa is just villages and, that there's no modernity because of the kinds of films. And it's interesting also in terms of audiences that we've had at Africa in Motion Film Festival, that when we would challenge their perceptions of what African cinema should be, so I always use the famous example of a South African film called Of Good Report, which is a kind of noir serial killer, film. And we screened that one year, and then we had audiences saying afterwards, oh, but that's not an African film. And it's like, well, it's an African director, it's set in Africa, it's an African, set in South Africa, it's a South African story. So it might not be what you think an African film should be, but it certainly, is an African film.
And just staying on that, I think that is pretty much the danger of how African films are read by Western audiences and how they interpret it as almost as though being documentary. I think one of the films that came out last year, Rungani Nyoni's I'm Not a Witch, she was exploring these themes of witchcraft and gender equality and the feminine, but there was an element of magic surrealism to it to kind of almost tell the audience that this is not a literal interpretation of life in Africa right now. But how do you think African filmmakers, what sort of challenges do you think they face in terms of having to, one, express stories the way that they would like to, but also being conscious of that there's a gaze that's seeing their work as though it's representative of a continent in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the perspectives and individual filmmakers have have different perspectives on you know, what they might, who their audiences are. So do they want to make their films for Toronto, Cannes, Berlin, you know, for those international audiences, or do they want to make their films for local audiences? Do they, like Nollywood, it's a very much a local industry, or films that don't really travel across to, you know, other kind of cultural contexts. So I think that, you know, it very much depends on the individual filmmaker, what his or her motivations are. But I also think that I've also heard African filmmakers say that, you know, they don't want to necessarily be burdened by telling African stories or telling stories in a certain way. So, you know, I think that if we lived in a world where everybody had equal access to the means of filmmaking and everybody could tell their own stories, but also other stories, then we would see a much more equitable kind of this, because what history has taught us is that, you know, Africa being represented through foreign eyes is something that's been going on for decades. Long before Africans started making films, there were foreigners coming into the country and representing Africa as an exotic backdrop, you know, to Western stories essentially. So I think that, but I think that African filmmakers should also have the freedom to come and make films in Australia, or you know, go to America and make a film that's set in New York, or you know. So I think that it doesn't have to be. I think it's also that kind of burden of, you know, you have to tell certain stories because that's what makes you an African filmmaker.
Yeah.
I know lots of filmmakers resist that.
Yeah. What about with you, Dorcas? I mean, with your show, Oz Africa Television, I mean, you're speaking to a specific audience and you're sharing stories of the wider African Australian community. I mean, how much are you considering? Is your audience the African Australian, or are you thinking about everyone else and kind of bringing them into those stories?
Well, I think initially is for the African audience. I think because it's important for us to see ourselves, you know, the thing that you're talking about, that, you know, what others expect to see of you. So first we have to see ourselves as human beings, just as people who, you know, we love to shop, we love to, I don't know, we have problems like anyone else. Do you know what I mean? Two people are sitting down talking about love. It's okay. It doesn't matter whether you're African or non-African. So that's my first thing. So, you know, for African people to see themselves as just normal people. And then beyond that is for other people outside of the African community, if you like, to see other African people as just members of the society. And I think it's the thing that you're saying about whether you're making the film for Canada or, you know, America or whatever. And it's also the power thing, I think, who's giving you the money. And so when they give you money, of course, there'll be, you know, things that you have to tick. And if their idea of what African film or African picture on screen looks like is this, and you're not living up to that, but you're so hungry to make a film as a, you know, African filmmaker, you're going to do that. And so it depends. So some people will, you know, carry on and do that and be dishonest to who they are, if you like, or they would decide to, okay, fine, I'll just do my own thing, like what we're doing. We can't just wait around and say the mainstream media is portraying us as bad people and keep pointing fingers. That one is not doing it right, and you know, we don't have money, we can't do anything about it. So you just start, you just do it, and that way you can do it your way, and so you don't have to report to anyone else.
Yeah. I guess picking up on what you're saying and just circling back to what Lizelle said at the beginning, and I'm sort of thinking about this idea of, you know, telling the African story, what does that look like, but also how little there is of African cinema, if we want to call it that is available to mainstream audiences. And a lot of it does come down to cost and does come down to access. I mean, Lizelle, you talked about how with Francophone Africa anyway, those post-colonial films were mainly backed by France, and there was that funding, and at least there was something there. There's some governments in you know, on the African continent that don't actually support a film industry. And so, you know, there are places where we are lacking in sort of seeing the diversity of these sorts of stories. But what I'm fascinated by is this project that you've been working on, Lizelle, which is the restoration of some of these lost classics that have disappeared for all sorts of reasons, which I'd like you to get into. But can you tell us about that and the importance of, ensuring that people rediscover these classics that some of us had never been exposed to? Like I discovered so many films that I didn't even know because of the lost classics.
Yeah.
So the project has been sort of going on for more than 10 years. In the early days of Africa in Motion, we screened some films that was actually initially discovered by my PhD supervisor, Professor David Murphy, in archives in Paris, in the Cinémathèque Afrique in Paris. And these were films by Francophone West African directors that were, there was sort of maybe one kind of dusty 16mm print left of the film, and he would go to the Cinémathèque Afrique and sit in a dusty room and, watch these films, and they were never seen. And they were films by, they were lesser known films, often short films by directors that then went on to make feature films that are better known, or they are films by directors that are just not sort of part of the canon. So when I talk about the canon of, say, Francophone West African cinema, people like Sembene and Mambeti, like we've said. But then there are also all these other directors. So, for example, there's a director from Niger called Mustafa Alassane, who was Africa's first animator. And in fact, he started making films. His first film he made before Sembene made his first film. Yeah. So in a way, if history was written differently, then Alassane might have been known as the father of African cinema instead of Sembene. So these sort of like hidden history, these histories, these alternative histories that really like intrigued us, and what if we were to kind of recover these films, what new sort of genealogies and legacies of African cinema would become known. So we then we published a book called Lost African Classics: New Histories of African Cinema in 2014. In which we have different chapters. Over 30 films are discussed from all over the continent. So whereas we started in West Africa, we opened it up to the entire continent eventually. And then we wanted to do a practical project to actually now kind of bring some of these lost films to audiences. So we had some funding from a research council in the UK. And we screened, I think, around 25 of the classics. There are 5 African film festivals in the UK. We've got a consortium, so we work together. So we toured a lot of these classics to all over the UK. And very significantly, and probably one of the most exciting parts of the project, was that we restored 3 women's films. So a film from Zimbabwe, one from Tunisia, and one from Senegal. So we digitized them, created English subtitles, and then created new high-quality digital versions. In some cases, the films have never existed with English subtitles, or there's sort of one copy left, maybe with French subtitles or not subtitled at all. So in the case of Fatma 75, the Tunisian film, that has never existed with English subtitles. So the film was made in 1976, so it had a very belated sort of world premiere at the festival last year. So in the case of Fatma 75, the film, one of the reasons why it became lost was because of censorship. So it's a feminist film by a female filmmaker called Salma Bakar, and she's critical of the government, she's critical of the kind of patriarchal foundations of Islamic society, and of course the film was regarded as too controversial at the time. So censorship plays a role. Of course, also financial resources. Lots of African films have become lost because of lack of kind of infrastructures for archiving, for digitization, and so on. So, for all these reasons, there's so many films out there that just never, are never seen. So we've just sort of tried to kind of play a small part in sort of memorializing and kind of excavating some of these films to then become more widely available. There are other initiatives as well. Some of you might be aware of Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Foundation. So he restored, his first film was Trans, a Moroccan music documentary, his first African film. So the story goes that Scorsese was watching television late at night, sort of channel hopping, and then this film came on, and he was totally blown away by it, and that sort of sparked his interest in African cinema. So last year at the FESPACO Film Festival in Burkina Faso, which is the biggest African film festival in the world, there was a kind of big announcement that the Cinematheque in Bologna, with Scorsese's World Cinema Foundation, are going over the next few years are going to restore 50 African classics. So they've made that commitment. They've already done a few of them. There's another film, Sileo, by Metondo from Mauritania, that was also a kind of mythical film that everybody always talks about, but nobody ever gets to see because it's not available on DVD or on a print. So that one was restored last year. So there are, different initiatives, and now I think with improvements in technology and also possibilities of digitization to actually make films available online, I think online streaming can play a massive role in increasing access to African cinema. So there are lots of exciting initiatives that hopefully will see some of these histories and legacies preserved.
Yeah. Dorcas, just following up on what Lizelle talked about in terms of the challenges of African filmmaking in the past, and I guess given your context now here in Australia and your documentation of African Australian stories, how much has access to technology, digital technology, I guess, made it easier for you to go about recording these stories?
It helped a lot. First of all, everyone's got a little mobile phone and you can pretty much do amazing things with that stuff. And so if there was no social media, for example, I don't think we would exist, because we don't have funds for marketing, big marketing campaigns. We don't have that, but we have access to social media, which is immediate, and you can share any story that you want to share. So technology has definitely helped a lot, and I'm pleased to hear that we will get more of the classics to come out, because at the moment if you find it's really bad, and you almost can't even go past how bad it looks on screen. But if it's restored and done properly, then you can kind of enjoy it. So I think technology and the digital space is quite important for all of us to be able to share. And I guess digital goes beyond the borders, because if we didn't have that, people in Africa or anywhere else in the world, they wouldn't be able to see what an African Australian story is like when it's told by an African Australian. So it's quite important for us.
Yeah. Lizelle, coming back to your restoration project, and I'm interested in the African female filmmakers, because for me, the Lost African Classics opened up that world for me. I had rarely come across work made by female filmmakers, and it's just very interesting how much of a feminist perspective they take. And I wonder if for many of them it was just a natural way of being. But when I was watching Fatma 75, for example, have any of you seen the retrospective that MIF have curated on African cinema? Yeah, there's a few people that have seen it. Fatma 75, which is a non-fiction film, it's a documentary film essay. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in my life. And there was something really quite wonderful about having a female protagonist, in many ways, guiding us through the decades of that period in, was it Algeria? Tunisia. And then also, it was supposed to be part of the program, but it's not anymore, but Mohsen from Senegal as well. For me, it was just a very liberating thing to see a female filmmaker's gaze and how they looked at those sorts of stories and the perspective that they bring to how we interpret African identity, especially from a female lens. And I wonder if you could just speak more about that and why you're also fascinated by that and female representation.
Yeah, so I think that, so my PhD research was on women in African cinema, so I've spent a lot of time kind of watching lots of women's films and thinking about women's films. And the reason why I'm interested in it in the first instance is, the very simple reason, as you say, that they present stories and they tell stories in a different way because they present stories from a female point of view. And I think that working on women's film, of course, resonates a lot with what's going on today in filmmaking globally. So I think, we talked about it earlier, the 82 women on the steps of the Palais de Cinema in Cannes that said, the 1,600 films that have been in competition over the years, only 82 have been directed by women. So we know that all over the world, I think the statistics show internationally that something like 11% of films are directed by women. So of course, that is a problem because it means that we mostly hear stories through the male perspective. And in terms of the films that we mostly see, it's the white male perspective. So we get a skewed, very one-sided point of view of storytelling. So I was very interested in these films that, as you say, with both the examples that you mentioned, have female protagonists that put women at the center of the narrative. And I say this, and people have questioned me about it, but I absolutely believe that when you look at women's films and women's filmmaking, and not only in Africa but across the world, women make films about women. They make films about their own stories, their own lived experiences. They switch, the protagonists to, as I say, put women at the center of the narratives, and they tell stories in a specific way. And when I say this to my students, then they often say, "Oh, but what about Catherine Bigelow? She makes films about war and about surfing, and these are not sort of my." And then I say, "Well, she's an exception, and she still, presents those stories about war and so on through a female gaze." So I'm very interested in that gendered gaze. I think it exists in filmmaking, in the aesthetic and in the narratives and in the themes and in the style of the film as well. In terms of the underrepresentation of women in African filmmaking, the reasons are very much the same as anywhere else in the world. Lots of different reasons. Women have to multitask, they have to reconcile lots of different aspects of their lives. They are mothers. They are not encouraged to become filmmakers. If they study filmmaking, they're geared towards certain roles, like wardrobe, production, editing. They work behind the scenes. The whole idea of the male auteur that became so popular in European cinema in particular is actually a complete fallacy, because filmmaking is always a very multifaceted, multi-leveled process that involves a lot of people. So this idea of the male going on stage and the male kind of director going on stage and receiving an award for best film, became the way that we sort of started perceiving film and filmmaking and the kind of authorship of film. But actually, there's so much more that we should look at, and structural inequalities in terms of film schools and funding, networking between women, to encourage more women to become part of the industry. And I think that, very crucially, I think the Me Too campaign has also shown one of a very kind of important problem for women to flourish within the film industry. There's been various African initiatives at the back of Me Too. So South Africa started an organisation called SWIFT, of women in working in the audiovisual industries, and I did a survey that I think 71, definitely more than 70% of women working in different roles in the film and television industries in South Africa said that they have been, exposed to some form of sexual harassment or worse within the industry. So I think creating safe spaces for women, creating kind of environments where women can be creative, also where women are not going to be undermined. If a female director is directing a male crew, and or the camera, no, you can't carry this camera, it's too heavy. Like all these kinds of, kind of stereotypes and these sort of prejudices that exist, and they exist in Africa as well. So I think the reasons are very much the same for the underrepresentation of women, and I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of funding, training opportunities, networking opportunities, and so on, that can be done to encourage more women to make films, because I think it's crucially important, and we should be striving towards a 50-50 ratio. Like that is what we should be striving to. And we see also now that the BFI, for example, in the UK, the British Film Institute, have now, they've put these sort of quotas in place, because a few years ago they thought, no, if we just have a sort of level playing field, like women, it will sort of just naturally happen. In a few years, we will just have 50-50 representation of, men and women in the industry. And then they realized, no, but it's not happening. If we don't actually reward people for, having a kind of equal balance in crew, then it's not going to happen. So they set certain things in place attached to their funding to encourage that. So I think these are very positive steps.
Dorcas, one of the things that I enjoy a lot about African cinema, if I can call it that, since we've kind of blown that out of the water, but for the context of for this conversation, when I refer to it, I'm sort of talking about post-colonial films that were made in the industries that emerged from some of these countries. And one of the things that I like about those films is how they almost always explore social political issues, despite the fact that the narratives are very much... I think about Tuki Buki, for example, which is young people that are trying to seek a better life somewhere else. But also in the backdrop, you are placed in, I think it was Senegal, wasn't it?
Yes,
Senegal, at that particular point in history. And so you also have an awareness of the politics that are playing out as you're watching these young people's journey going on. Why do you think there is, I think even one of the films in the program here at MIF, Rafiki, which is a contemporary film from Kenya, it's about two lesbian lovers, and it's also deeply set in sort of exploring the political issues within the Kenyan context, yet it is just a love story in many ways. Why do you think some African filmmakers choose to explore some of the political issues that are playing out in their environments at a particular point through their work?
I think, those are some of the ones that, if you like, maybe are trying to be not rebel as such, but I think that whole thing of who's giving you money and who are you making the film for, and so some of the filmmakers, I think, based on what the films that you're talking about, are brave enough, if you like, to kind of say, look, here's my story, but this is also happening. This is the reading between the lines. This is the landscape that I come from. I maybe, the two Bonnie and Clyde character types in Tukibuki. I mean, they're going through the hardships of whatever everyone else is going through in the rural setting, as a university student, as a hustler, if you like, but it's all underpinned by what's happening politically. And I think to be able to tell that, it's pretty brave, depending on the times, you know what I mean? Because that was a bit earlier. Like now, if you look at, let's say, Beyonce, for example, and Jay-Z, they've taken the Tukibuki and they've kind of elevated it. And those people who haven't seen it, they look at Beyonce and Jay-Z right now and they listen to the song, everyone goes, what's the track? Ape shit? Pardon my French, that one. But when you look at it, it's so politically charged, it's so personal. And when she says, I can't believe we made it, it almost feels like she's talking about her relationship with Jay-Z, and speaking on behalf of the two characters from Tukibuki, because one did made it to Paris and the other one didn't, but also we're moving forward and we're being represented and we're forcing our way into the canon, especially with Jay-Z and Beyonce, because they are part of this landscape that was once upon a time only for the white elite male, if you like, even. So I think it's bravery more than anything, because you can choose to just say, well, I'm going to tell an African story in accordance with the Western gaze or whoever's giving me the money, or you can say, I will put in some good stuff in there that actually tell an honest story of where I am, who I am at this time. So,
Would you agree with that, Lizelle? I mean, do you think, when I think about a lot of the films that are coming out in the West now, and I think about the stories that are being told, it's very rarely do you actually get a sense of the political landscape. You don't really know where in history you're situated with everything that's going on. But I do get a strong sense from a lot of the films that come out of the African continent that there is a need to situate that as part of the bigger story in which that's being told. Why do you think they choose that approach?
So just to pick up on what you said about stories coming out of the West and Hollywood. So an African filmmaker said to me last year that Hollywood is done. Hollywood is kind of has emptied out of stories. So they're telling essentially the same story over and over again. And I think that's where we're now looking at Africa, because there's so many stories still to tell, like so many untold stories, and we get so some of the most exciting films are now coming out of Africa. And I think that in terms of the kind of subject matters, I think it's often and very much based on lived experience. Again, linking to what I said about female filmmakers, and I think that a lot of African filmmakers have this need to tell stories that grew out of their lived experience. Of course, I'm not saying that of course there's the popular Nollywood industry, which is an entertainment industry, which is a specific purpose, which is not cinema supposed to be political or educational. And of course, those cinemas in industries should exist as well, because a healthy film industry should have film for all different kinds of reasons. It should have political documentaries, it should have educational stuff, it should have the more art house stuff, it should also have a space for the avant-garde and the experimental, and of course the commercial as well. So I think that that should all exist, but I do, a Zimbabwean filmmaker once said to me that to be a filmmaker in Africa is so difficult that if you want to make a film, you better have something important to say. So, so there's this idea that, these stories are so urgent, and it's so, the barriers that you have to overcome, and especially, of course, those barriers have been broken down now a lot through the accessibility of digital technology, but certainly in the celluloid era, it was so difficult to make films that those were important stories and important things that filmmakers had to say and wanted to say.
I can strongly, I think, agree with that, because I feel, for me anyway, in making films in an Australian context as an African Australian, I do feel the urgency of telling the stories, but also the pressure to document. Some of the stories are fictionalized, so they're not really real, but there's also a pressure to document those stories, because if they're not, it's this fear that they might be erased as though we never really existed, and that feeds into my filmmaking practice when some days I'm like, I just want to make something. But I guess the consequences of telling deeply political work in many ways leads to censorship, leads to films being banned, and these are real consequences for filmmakers that do want to tell an important story. I guess in the Restoration Project, how many films did you come across that perhaps were banned, were censored for having material that the government's opposed in those contexts?
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of films. Another film that had a kind of checkered production history was Flame, the Zimbabwean film, which is screening tomorrow. So that film is again a female story. It's a story of two women who joined the Zimbabwean Liberation War. I won't give away the plot entirely. For those of you who want to see it, but it's basically a kind of story of war and conflict told through a female perspective. And part of the story is that some of the women who were involved in the liberation struggle, who trained as soldiers to fight the colonial regime of Britain at the time, were not treated always so well by their male comrades. And this is really what the story draws attention to. So there's a kind of incident of sexual abuse, and this was the reason why the film was banned initially by the Zimbabwean government, because it tarnished the legacy of the veterans, because it kind of disrupted the narrative of these brave soldiers that were fighting against the colonial oppressor, and that that everything wasn't as hunky-dory as history might want us to believe. So that was the reason. So that the film was all kinds of stories of how the Ministry of Information sent agents to the filmmaker's house to seize the rushes. The producer spent some nights in prison, and it sort of took some time for the film to be made, and to actually eventually be released, simply for the reason that it told the story in a way that that didn't suit the authorities. And again, I think that's what is interesting about women's stories, and also the stories of of other minorities. We're talking about women, but we also know that we have to think about diversity and in all different kinds of ways in terms of sexual orientation and religion or whatever. But those stories can often open up these hidden histories, these marginalized narratives that are not part of the mainstream narrative of history, and that's why they're so important. I was telling you earlier, I saw the Yayoi Kusama film this morning. Some of you were there. It was a massive sold-out screening, and it just told the story about a Japanese female artist whose story and her importance, working in New York at the same time as Andy Warhol, Rothko, Jackson Pollock, all these filmmakers, all these artists, and she was just as important, but her story has completely disappeared and has been completely erased. So I was thinking this documentary is recovering that story, and that's why they're so important.
So look, there's a lot that I could ask you, but I guess my follow-on, and I'll ask it to both of you. So Dorcas, perhaps you want to start. Where's the future for African films and African stories? I mean, Lizelle just said that Hollywood's pretty much dead. You know, how do you see African stories going forward? I mean, and who do you see telling those stories, and what role do digital technologies and the internet play in what that future looks like?
Well, I think the African cinema has a bright future, if you like, because, you know, it's things like yourselves that you're putting into place, and Scorsese and other projects where people are actually taking interest, and not just interest, but actually doing something about it and restoring the classics so that we know where it's all coming from, because, you know, history makes you who you are and helps you move forward. And so I think, you know, it's exciting to see what's happening. And the digital technology is incredible. It's going to make it even easier for people like myself sitting here, you know, be able to see something that's happening back home in South Africa or Nigeria or whatever, because at a click of a button you can be there almost. And so I think it's pretty exciting. And the urgency that you speak about, that people need to tell their story and with their own voices, and, you know, and tell it in as honest as one can be with given the situation that they're in. So it's pretty exciting. I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. So Djibril Diop Mabeti said, and I just have to get this right, he said, it's good for the future of Africa that cinema exists. But I think we can also reverse that and say it's good for the future of cinema that Africa exists. Because there are going to be, you know, all these stories coming out, and we see that increasingly. And I think it can only grow and proliferate. I completely agree with you that digital technology is making filmmaking much more accessible. For me, it's been astonishing the past 15 years that I've been studying African cinema and curating African cinema, is to just see the proliferation of cinema from countries and from regions that you've just never before seen any work. There are new stories, fresh stories that can challenge Hollywood. And I think online distribution, as I said, VOD platforms can play a big role. Film festivals, of course, is massively important. Less than 1% of cinema on general release in theatres worldwide consists of African cinema. So general kind of mainstream theatrical releases are not the future of a marginalised cinema. So it's the role of film festivals, special retrospectives, and online platforms as well can play a role to sort of create more opportunities for film to be seen. And I think that it's crucially important that we should think about audiences as well. And I know that often filmmakers don't think about audiences, but you do meet filmmakers who they just want to make their film because they're an artist and they have a story that they want to tell, and they don't necessarily think about the audience. But luckily there are people like myself, like we kind of have, you know, we invest in also developing those audiences. Because if you say, and this is what you often hear by curators in the UK, for example, they say, people are not interested in African cinema. But if people never get the chance to see African cinema, then it's just a self-perpetuating cycle, because you're never developing those audiences. And once those audiences are there, and there's a demand, and there's a taste and a need for African cinema, then that will encourage the growth. And I hope that's the future.
I love it, I love it. Rural life, sexuality, religion, class is a big one. I mean, from the films that are curated in the current program, in the retrospective in MIF, if you could briefly speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're talking about the when sort of African film scholarship started in the 1990s, there was a famous book called African Cinema, Politics and Culture that came out, written by a Malian scholar called Mansa Diawara, and he identified 3 categories of African films. He called them kind of cultural representation, historical confrontation, and return to the source. And of course, so they are the films that, you know, the kind of village films, or the return to the source films. Colonial confrontation, of course, what you talked about, the kinds of films that, you know, that talk about, you know, that the kind of violence of the colonial encounter. And then, what is the other one that I said? The third one? Yes. So those were very much the kind of early years of African cinema that, especially in the Francophone world, that those films, that a sort of corpus of films came out that could be thematically categorized as such. But I think one of the exciting things, again, is how filmmaking has now moved on to incorporate all these other themes as well. So, for example, at the time that Diawara wrote that book, there wasn't really diaspora cinema. So the idea, the cinema of exile, cinema of belonging, cinema of homecoming, those, and now we see that because, of course, a lot of African filmmakers, and this is also, again, from the early years, because filmmakers like Sembène Cissé, Sarah Mulderor studied in Russia. A lot of filmmakers now live in Paris, they live in France, they go and study in New York. So, of course, they tell stories about these migratory processes as well. So there's just all these new stories emerging as well. And, for example, a story like Rafiki, the lesbian love story, that is, it's a new theme for African cinema. And, of course, talking about banning, was immediately banned by the Kenyan government as well, which again shows how important it is that those stories should be told.
Well, I think it's that thing that you said. Some filmmakers, probably at some point, all of us are guilty of it. You just want to do the art because, you've got this brilliant idea and you want to do it. But I think taking the time to do certain steps like finding your audience, knowing your audience, doing your audience development, and doing your market analysis, all of these boring things that we don't really want to do, and answering those hard questions when somebody says, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to do it now? Who is it for? All of that sort of stuff. If we answer it properly, that's one. And the second one is I don't know if it's us here, but it's really important for like the African, people with money to support, because that's where the problem is. Because somebody will come from America with Hollywood money and say, oh, this is a great story, let's do it. Here's the money, let's just do it. But here at home, we don't have people who actually support the initiatives to a point where they can be commercially viable. You can be supported to a 10-minute long film, which would be great, and then it'll go to a festival, and but it will not get to where you would want your own Wakanda to be, you know what I mean? So I think if you do your homework, and then hopefully, as this African cinema is developing and changing and growing, people with the money are listening and they can dig deep and kind of invest into the stories that we want to see, the important stories that we want to tell. So I think that would help, because if you've got the right money, then you can do your audience development properly. You can work with the right people to answer the right questions so that you can get to where you want to be, I reckon.
I would add to that, I think it depends what kind of films you want to make. I think when I think about my filmmaking, because a lot of it is documenting the stories of African Australians, and one of the projects that I'm working on looks at the stories of Africans that came on the First Fleet from 1778, so going as far back, and these stories have never been documented. So for me, it's about how do you document these stories and ensure that our existence isn't forgotten, isn't erased. So for me, I'm not thinking about the audience, I'm just thinking about, I want people to ensure that they know that there was an existence of this group of people. So I think it would depend on what you're trying to make. If you're making something that is entertaining, that is speaking to a broader audience, I think absolutely considering the audience. But I think if you're telling something that is really to just ensure that those stories are captured, it's a whole different frame of how you go into telling that film or story.
Just to add to that, I don't think that all cinema has to be commercial and should be commercial. And I think that, if we were to only if there were only commercial stories, we would only hear stories that would kind of speak to a mass common denominator, and that the films would be so boring. So I think there is a place also for film that is more provocative, that challenge audience perspectives. And those films are not necessarily going to reach big audiences. And I think, as I said earlier, I think a healthy industry should allow space for all these different kinds of films. Yeah, if you talk about kind of restoration and archiving in particular, then of course there are initiatives. This, as I said, the Scorsese project was actually announced at FESPACO Film Festival, which is a festival in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. It's the biggest and most important African film festival in the world. There are partners in Burkina Faso in particular involved in this project, and I think that's very important, that it shouldn't just be a kind of one-sided thing. I don't actually know the specifics of whether there's money from the Burkinabe government going in, but in terms of film production, what I could say in film exhibition, Burkina Faso, of course, has been the Burkinabe government has been at the forefront of promoting African cinema because it's one of the poorest. It's always sort of one of the poorest countries in the world, but it is so rich in film, and because the government has invested in that. So I think a lot of it depends on African governments. The South African government, of course, does a lot, and was also critiqued for the way that it dishes out money to filmmakers. But I think for filmmaking and distribution and archiving and so on. But I think I think there are African countries that are increasingly taking this seriously.
But what about the add-on to that, which was the responsibility of institutions that show these films, for example, to perhaps create a fund or support a fund of African filmmakers on the continent that can then go on to make the films? Because I think that was the add-on to your question.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just think again in terms of the restoration project. So, for example, I'm of course, I live in the UK, a wealthy country. I work at a university, so I'm in a privileged position. The project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We restored the films. We invested a lot in the digitization, subtitling, and restoration of the films, and we gifted those films back to the filmmakers. And we basically, we don't make any money out of. Of course, the project was subsidized, so we're not kind of concerned about making money or making any profit. But that was a way that we said, okay, let's use this money that we can get from a wealthy country like the UK to restore it, and then kind of present the films back to the filmmakers, so they can now make money out of those films. So that was sort of, an important thing for us, was that it is sort of filtering back to benefiting the filmmakers.
Yeah. Dorcas, did you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to say that is super important because I think, and we touched on this backstage before, about when people think of Africa, they think of black people, right? For starters. I mean, you said it yourself, you're South African, you and I are South African, and we know all of that. So I think another thing is when people hear or see that, the Scorseses of this world are restoring an African, it's almost like, who's owning this story? How do we then make sure that the people who, have their ownership, or is it colonization all over again? And so I think, to all of those institutions that are trying to help, it's great, but wouldn't it be great to kind of empower the people to kind of say, here, wherever you are in Burkina Faso or whatever, we're going to put up this place, we're going to train you up, we're going to give you the tools or whatever, depending on how much it costs and all of those things, but almost like take ownership of what it is that you're doing, go find those films yourselves, and then look after them yourselves. I think that's a good thing to do.
That's a
great
point.
That's a great point.
If I could just add to that, that's why we're absolutely delighted that MIF brought this package of classic films. And Thomas said to me when I met him when I arrived that, I hope you don't mind that we've kind of pinched your programs. No, this is absolutely why we did this project, so that the films can actually get a new life and travel further. So it's this kind of sharing, as you say, that we try to kind of embody with our work.
And speaking of the scarcity, I started an initiative 2 weeks ago. It's going to be an annual initiative, and it's essentially for people that work in the film and screen industry from diverse communities. And the idea is to have a community of people that you can lean on that come from different backgrounds, where we have a directory. So in a couple of years, we'll have a directory that film production companies can't say, we couldn't find anyone that could do this. We'll have a networking event, and we'll be having screenings. So it's something that we started 3 weeks ago now. But yeah, if you Google behind the screens, you'll be able to find all the information on it. But we're certainly trying to at least create a community so it doesn't feel as lonely out there, because like you said, it's like when you're stuck in your own world, it's very hard to see what else is out there. Anyway, on that note, please join me in thanking Lizelle Dorcas and also Miff and Thomas Caldwell, who's right at the back, who programmed this retrospective, which in itself is such a wonderful thing because I don't think any other Australian festival has done something like this. So I think it's pretty cool. So big up, Thomas.